Hello again, and welcome to part 2 of the premiere episode of The Ownership Effect. I'm your host, Jim Bonham. In part 1, we talked about the miracle moment and how a business owner's decision to sell to employees and form an ESOP can be a transformational moment for the company, for the employees, and for the communities. In part 2, we're going to dive deeper into that process. Business owners have many options when they decide to retire or sell their companies. They can leave the business to their families, sell to a strategic buyer or a competitor, a private equity company, and other alternatives. But with many of those choices, there's no guarantee the business will remain in the community, maintain the founder's values and legacy, or retain jobs. As you'll hear from Drew Tavss, the CEO of Mid-South Building Supply in Springfield, Virginia, they found a better way, transitioning to an ESOP. Drew's going to walk us through the miracle moment at Mid-South Building Supply and really get into the decision-making of the company's leadership when they decided to form their ESOP. With me now is Drew Tavss, the Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Mid-South Building Supply, a company servicing the Mid-Atlantic states and headquartered in Northern Virginia. Drew, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Tell us about Mid-South as a business. What do you do? What do you sell?
We're a wholesale distributor. I would say we're also a very large contracting company. A big piece of our business is installing cabinetry for builders. We sell to remodeling contractors, cabinetry, siding, windows, and we install most of everything that we sell.
And what states do you do business in?
Virginia, Maryland, and a little bit in Pennsylvania.
How many employees do you have?
We have 165 employees. We have 5 branches and 4 remote locations that are kitchen showrooms.
And when was Mid-South Building Supply first founded?
We were founded in 1966, way before my time.
Way before your time. Okay.
Founded by a guy named Norm Rales and a guy named Merv Snyder. Norm had been in the home improvement business. Merv Snyder owned a distribution company in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and Norm came to the Washington area with money from Merv and a little bit from himself to form the first Mid-South in this area.
And what was your main mechanism of marketing? I mean, Norman was known as a bit of a door-to-door salesman when he really first started, right?
Yeah, I mean, outside sales territories. They hired somebody to basically knock on doors, take names, meet with remodeling contractors, meet with builders, and establish relationships. You know, one of the things we say is at Mid-South, we can say we sell product, but we really build relationships.
Tell me about Norman Rales. He's got a really fascinating life story, almost like a Horatio Alger story.
Norman was a serial entrepreneur. From what I understand as a kid, his mother died in childbirth. He and several siblings were put into the Hebrew Asylum in, I think it was Brooklyn, New York, and stayed there until he was 15 years old, at which point the story is they gave him a toothbrush and $5 and said, go out and make a life for yourself. So really, he started from nothing. He was involved in sports then, built relationships with kids that he knew at the Hebrew Asylum, and I can get a little later, I'll tell you some stories there.
Those friendships he kept his whole life.
I remember years ago when I was early at Mid-South, and I was with Mid-South for several years before we became an ESOP. And Norm invited me on a trip to Aruba, and he said, I'm taking kids from the basketball team. I said, really? So he sent tickets to my house, and we're flying to New York, or we're going to meet at a gate to go to Aruba. And so my wife and I are there, and I said, we're looking for some kids. And I walk up and I see Norm, and he says, I want to introduce you to some people. This is Ziggy, this is Izzy, these were people who were in their 60s, and they were kids from the basketball team. And that's when I learned that, he basically found these guys and every year tried to take them someplace.
I asked about that story, and I knew a little bit about it because one of the most important things in forming an ESOP is the character of the person who owns the business and what they bring to the table when they are thinking about walking away from the table. And Norman, it sounds like, and everything I've always heard about him, was always very committed to his employees and his, the people who were involved in his life. So tell us a little bit about those early years when Norman, before the ESOP was formed, and he was thinking about exiting the business.
So you have to understand something about Norman. I said he's a serial entrepreneur. I never knew him to work directly at Mid-South Building Supply.
Wow.
Even when I've been around Mid-South since before I joined. I was on their audit team. I joined as a controller, out off the audit team. And Norm basically was remote management. He had a president in place. He had put his son in as president, and that didn't work out. So I joined shortly after his son left, and they brought in a new management team, brought in a new president, a president of sales, a new vice president of finance. When that happened, the controller left, and they reached out to me, said, would you like to join Mid-South? And here I am.
And so in transitioning the business, he sort of tried his son.
He tried his son, brought in professional management. That lasted about a year. And then he brought in a guy who became my mentor, Mel Rosenblatt, somebody he had been in business with through Jones and Brown and through manufacturing.
But he decided he wanted to sell the business.
What was occurring is I think he brought Mel in to help fix the business.
Okay.
And then the conversation was Norm would like to sell the business. And Mel and I met with several people who came to us, I guess, through brokers to sit across the table and try to sell ourselves. Nothing really came of it. Norm had an idea of what he wanted. He says, I want $7.3 million. Okay.
He had a valuation in mind.
Valuation in mind. And a story of how the ESOP came about. I was looking for a credit manager. I went to a credit manager's meeting. So I'm at a luncheon. And we're going around the table, and people are saying, what their company's like, who owns their company. And I met a guy from Allied Plywood. I said, who owns your company? He says, we do. I said, what do you mean we do? We're an ESOP company. And so talked a little bit to him, came back, researched ESOPs a little bit, and then called him and said, I'd like to talk to the person who helped you put the ESOP together. And he put us together with a guy named Norman Kurland.
Yeah, and the challenge, of course, is that most workers don't have capital to buy into a business.
Yes.
So how does the ESOP solve that problem?
The employees only put in sweat equity. So the contributions to the ESOP are made by the company. The purchase of the ESOP basically is the responsibility of the company. And the repurchase of shares, repurchase obligations, ultimately the responsibility of the company. So if the company survives and it does well, then everybody does well.
So you went to this credit conference. Yes. You met these guys from Allied Plywood. They said, "Hey, we're owners," and then you took the idea.
So we went back and brought it to Mel Rosenblatt, who is my boss. I said, "Mel, what do you think?" And he says, "Well, let's talk to Norm." And Norm had a financial guy who worked with him, and they said this would be very interesting to do. So you talk about the character and being able to say, this makes sense. So what are the steps we have to do? We have to get a valuation done, an independent valuation. And Norm Kurland brought the team together. Ron Ludwig, who was probably one of the foremost ESOP attorneys of the time. Actually, he used to be the ESOP attorney for the ESOP Association. He kind of drew up documents. We had an independent valuation done. So the key was we understood what the ESOP would be, and then it took the funding. And Norm brought the bank to us. And Norm basically said, look, here's the deal. I'm going to sell the company. Here's the number. The valuation works, so we can make it work. I'm going to guarantee the debt. And we're going to sell 100% of the company to the ESOP, and we'll see what happens.
Now, that's something that a lot of people don't understand about ESOP companies. In fact, you'll even hear some founders say, well, I gave the company to my employees. But that's not really true. The employee is actually buying it from the owner and repaying the debt, the loan, with the future earnings of the company.
The trust.
The trust.
The employees are beneficial owners through the trust.
Did it take a lot of persuading to when you first brought the idea to Norman?
No, as soon as he really embraced it from the beginning because it was something he could control.
Okay.
Again, we had sat across the table from folks who had brought in other ideas, even folks coming in. At one point, an ESOP concept was talked about with somebody else, with mezzanine financing, a very complicated deal. But this he controlled. So if we didn't make it happen, he could go back, reach back in and take the company back.
Right.
Now, also, he didn't get something for nothing. So for the guarantee, we paid him $100,000 a year consulting fee.
Okay.
And the goal was, that was a lot of money back then.
Sure.
And the goal was, the consulting fee ends when you get me off the debt.
How long did that take?
Well, we ran into an interesting situation. Several years, 5 years into the ESOP, we were approached by a public company that said, we're expanding in this type of market. We would like to buy Mid-South. It was a really not for sale, or ESOP company. And we talked about perhaps putting a branch together and doing something together. And they said, how about selling a minority interest in the company? And we thought about it. And we sold a 30% minority interest to a company called Bird Incorporated. They were a public company. They were a manufacturer of siding and roofing. And they became a 30% owner of Mid-South. And before we did this, we had a vote from the employees. We did a presentation of why this would help, what it would do in terms of debt service, cutting interest costs, et cetera, and getting rid of the $100,000 a year.
Right.
So they were great partners, and they stayed with us from 91 for probably 5 years, and then they began to have problems. And so we flew up to Boston and bought our shares back for 35 cents on the dollar. and became 100% employee owned again.
And since then, how many times has the trust bought the company?
We just looked at that. So we bought the company for $7.3 million, and we have paid out $45 million so far.
Wow. So 7 to 8 times.
Yeah.
Over.
Yeah.
And now that's significant, right? Because what that represents in terms of the difference between a privately held company owned by an individual or a group of owners versus an ESOP, a family-owned business, it'll turn over once in a generation?
Yeah.
Or even less.
Yeah.
But your company has turned over 7 times.
$45 million has gone out to former and existing shareholders.
What does that do to your company? What does that do to the culture?
I think it drives home ownership. When the first people get cash out of the ESOP, it becomes real. It's one thing to get a certificate year after year. And you see, I remember when we formed the ESOP, and I asked Norm Curland, I said, look, we've been at this for 2 years, and I'm not getting any enthusiasm from my employees. Matter of fact, when we first brought it to all of the 35 people who existed at the time when we first bought the company, they looked at us like we were crazy. What do you mean saddling us with debt? We're going to go out of business, et cetera. So there's a lot of fear that went along with it. And the conversation was, when they get to the point that they take a look at their certificate and it approaches a year of income, it becomes very real. And then when it begins to be a multiple of earnings, it becomes very real. And then the first time somebody tastes it, it becomes real. And so we also realized that it's one thing to have share ownership, that you get a reward later in life. But we also realized we needed a plan in place that would share profits during the year. So we created 2 bonus plans, what I'll call a dividend plan based upon your account value. So folks who are here for longer would get more. Right. And if you hit certain goals, you'd say distribute $30,000 a month, and they would get their pro rata share. Then if you hit another loftier goal, you take the same $30,000 and divide it equally.
How do you think being an ESOP changes your perspective as the leader, a CEO of the business? What do you think about that you don't think other CEOs think about?
Hopefully nothing. I mean, I'm hoping that all CEOs look at the big picture, that the most important thing to do is you take care of your customers. Your customers will take care of you, and you'll build a company, be profitable. Certainly we understand the impact it has on people. The other thing that I would say that maybe they don't have to think about is, what do you have to do to make sure that you have the repurchase obligation covered? Because that's the ghost that sits on the shoulder of every ESOP company.
Explain what that is, the repurchase obligation.
Everyone earns shares over time. At some point, you're going to have to buy those shares from that employee. And, typically it's death, disability, retirement, or diversification. When somebody diversifies at age 56, they can take 25% out, and that's a mandatory put. So you have to have the cash to be able to do that. Again, at 61, mandatory put. And then we built into our plan that when someone reaches retirement age, they can begin their retirement distributions. and still be employed. So all of these things play into it.
So to analogize it to like a family-owned business where, the business is still privately owned, it would be like, all right, Dad and Uncle Tom and Aunt Susie all have shares in the company, and Uncle Tom, he's ready to retire, and he wants to exit. The rest of the company has
Where's the cash?
where's the cash to buy Uncle Tom out of the company. So it's not terrible. It's not entirely unique.
Well, you also in privately held businesses too. You have estate taxes to worry about too at given points in time in our history.
That's right.
So, and where does the cash come from?
Right. So you have to manage your cash flow busily. Now, there are some benefits clearly for being an ESOP in terms of the way that you're taxed.
So, back in, I guess it was 1997, I got a phone call at home from Ron Ludwig, who's our attorney. He says, Drew, sitting on President Clinton's desk right now is a bill that would allow a subchapter S corporation to be an ESOP. So what does that mean? Began playing around, how an S corp is taxed. Yes. So long and short, if you're an S corp ESOP, when the company makes money, the K-1 rolls over to the trust, and the trusts don't pay taxes. So basically, we've gotten away without having to pay federal tax for quite a number of years. What that does is that allows more money to funnel into the company and to continue to grow the business. Ultimately, Uncle Sam gets theirs, because when it comes to all of us, it gets taxed at ordinary income rates.
Yeah, it is. So if Norm were around today, what do you think he would think about Mid-South Building Supply?
He'd be very proud.
Yeah.
He'd be very proud. Again, he took care of the people who worked with him at a variety of companies. So when I knew him, he was, he owned Mid-South Building Supply. He was involved in Kenwood Financial. One of the things that when Mel Rosenblatt first joined us is Norm said, look, I'd like to get involved in other companies, and I'd like you to go hire your replacement. So I was controller. I hired a new controller, and Mel and I went on to take a little bit of Norm's seed money and create a couple of other companies. And of them, 3 of them became ESOPs.
If there's any one maybe elevator pitch you would make to a business owner who is, part of the silver tsunami that we talk about, the wave of retiring business owners who are, the baby boomers who need to come up with an exit strategy, what would be your elevator pitch for them to consider forming an ESOP?
I guess it would be, how did you get here? Who helped you get here? And you want to take care of the people who helped you get here.
All right. Well, we've been here with Drew Tavss, the CEO of Mid-South Building Supply. Thank you so much for joining us. A terrific company. If you live in the Washington metropolitan area or the mid-Atlantic states, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, D.C., check them out. They're a great company.
If you're contemplating an ESOP and you want some more information, feel free to call too.
All right. Thank you, Drew. Thanks for joining us today.
You got it.
Thanks for listening to The Ownership Effect. I hope after these first episodes, you have a better understanding of employee ownership and ESOPs in America, and the power of employee ownership to build and retain wealth for our companies, employees, and communities. Join us for future episodes on The Ownership Effect as we take you on a journey to discover what makes ESOPs so special, why employees love working at their companies, and how elected officials in Washington can help significantly expand employee ownership in America. Thanks for listening, and please remember to subscribe, like, and rate us wherever you get your favorite podcasts and our YouTube channel. We'll see you next time on The Ownership Effect.